Mr. President, for more than a month, many of my colleagues and I have come to this floor to talk about our responsibility as senators, to do our job, and to consider the President's Supreme Court nominee, Merrick Garland. That's right, here in one of the world's greatest deliberative bodies, where we have debated war and peace, civil rights, the right of women to vote, we're now engaged in a debate about whether or not the Senate should carry out one of its most basic constitutional responsibilities. Even more troubling than the refusal of some senators to even consider a Supreme Court nominee is that this is one in a series of failures over the past year. It's not an isolated incident. It's a pattern. Back home in Indiana, our priorities are clear. We want good jobs and safe communities. Hoosiers are asking important questions of their elected officials, such as, what is the Senate doing to strengthen our economy? What are we doing to keep Americans safe? Today, I want to talk about two additional simple things that the Senate can do to strengthen our economy and to keep our country safe. Both have strong bipartisan support already. We just have to do our job. The first relates to the Export-Import Bank. Last December, after months of negotiations and a 5-month lapse, Congress agreed with bipartisan support to reauthorize the Export-Import Bank, the official export credit agency of the United States of America that helps American companies, including small businesses from my home state and from everyone else's, compete in the global economy. It doesn't get more common sense than approving an agency whose sole purpose is to help create more American jobs at no cost to taxpayers. In fact, in 2014, the bank supported $27.5 billion in U.S. exports and more than 164,000 American jobs, and returned over $675 million to the U.S. Treasury. The bank creates jobs, reduces the deficit, and spurs economic growth. It's a win-win-win. Yet despite bipartisan approval last December, Senate inaction continues to hamstring the bank that keeps it from fully functioning. You see, in order to improve certain financing, the bank needs a minimum of 3 Senate-approved board members. Today, we have only 2. That's because board nominee Mark McWatters, a Republican, has been stuck in the Senate Banking Committee for more than 3 months. At a time when American companies are struggling to compete in an economy that is often rigged by other countries manipulating their currency, intellectual property theft, insurmountable foreign regulatory barriers, there are a few members of this body who are intent on obstructing this important economic tool by refusing to consider Mr. McWatters' nomination in order to advance an extreme ideological agenda. So here we are again, willfully allowing an important tool for economic growth to sit idle simply because some in the Senate refuse to do their jobs. While most Americans find it hard to believe we can't agree on something as common sense as supporting the American economy, perhaps more troubling is the refusal to confirm an official to lead our nation's efforts to combat terrorist financing around the world. Mr. Adam Szubin. Adam Szubin is the nominee to be Treasury Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Crimes. His job is to identify and to disrupt the lines of financial support to international terrorist organizations, to proliferators of weapons of mass destruction, narcotics traffickers, and other actors posing a threat to U.S. national security or foreign policy. It's a critical job. And just about anyone you ask will tell you that Adam Szubin is the guy we want doing this job. He has helped shape and enforce U.S. sanctions against our adversaries for nearly a decade, under both Republican administrations and Democratic administrations. He is recognized as a leading expert on terrorism financing and is widely considered one of our nation's best tools in taking the financial footing out from under terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and countering adversaries like Iran, North Korea, and increasingly Russia. Today marks 1 year since Mr. Szubin was nominated, an entire year. For 1 full year, our country has worked to combat terrorist financing and enforce and expand sanctions against key adversaries without a confirmed official to lead the charge. At a time when our sanctions regimes are critical to countering Iran's ballistic missile program, North Korea's nuclear weapons development, and Russia's renewed aggression, at a time when U.S. military personnel are serving in harm's way in locations around the world combating ISIS and Al-Qaeda and their affiliates, the United States Senate is undermining the ability of one of our nation's top counterterrorism officials to do his job. By failing to act on the nomination of Mr. Szubin, who people on both sides of the aisle agree is the perfect person for the job, we're undermining his credibility with the very countries we need in our side to effect these sanctions and to cut off funding flows to terrorists. The American people expect us to use every single resource we have to keep our nation safe. Yet when it comes to putting our strongest team on the field to fight back and to cut off terrorist financing, some in this body continue to put politics ahead of our national security. Why has Mr. Szubin not yet been confirmed as the Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Crimes? Simply put, the Senate refuses to do their job, to have a vote. Mr. President, I understand it's an election year, and there is much discussion in Washington about what is good political strategy for the different parties. While the timing may be inconvenient for some, I will remind my colleagues that every day outside of Washington, law enforcement officers, among many others, rely on a fully functioning Supreme Court for the legal guidance that serves as the basis of our founding promise of liberty and justice for all. I remind my colleagues that every day across our country, millions of hardworking men and women go to work to support their families, many of whom rely on jobs supported by the Export-Import Bank. And every day across the globe, our servicemen and women put their lives on the line to protect our country from terrorists and from foreign nations intent on doing us harm. Many of those terrorists and foreign nations are targets of the crippling sanctions the U.S. Treasury implements and enforces to help keep Americans safe. And Adam Szubin is leading that team. These men and women who go to work to support their families, the law enforcement officers who protect our communities, and the servicemen and women who fight for our great country every single day don't stop doing their jobs because it's an election year. Don't pass on confirmations because it's inconvenient timing. I've said it before, and I will say it again. Most Americans believe Congress can do something to help move our country forward. the very least, we should do no harm. We're falling short of this most basic standard. But we can change that right now by simply doing our job, by considering Merrick Garland's nomination to the Supreme Court, by doing our job to support the economy, by considering the nomination of Mark McWatters to sit on the board of the Export-Import Bank, and by doing our job to support our troops and protect our country, by considering the nomination of Adam Szubin to be Undersecretary of the Treasury for terrorism and financial crimes. This should be the very least that we do, and we need to do it now. Mr. President, let's follow the examples of those who elected us, who roll up their sleeves every day and go to work. It's time for us to roll up our sleeves and to go to work and to do our job. Mr. President, I yield back.